Senator Ted Cruz is here, and we were just talking about just sort of what fills the conservative plate, and it's a combination of things, and he can take them in whatever order he wants. Holding out an admitted sliver of hope for this year's result, the absolute value of continuing scrutiny on the ridiculousness of early voting and late counting and failure to assure election security, and focus on winning those 2 seats in Georgia. Busy time, Senator. Welcome. How you doing?
I'm doing terrific, Mark. It's great to be with you.
So pick any of them. Why don't we take those in order? It is hard, not impossible, but hard to see a path through the courts for a second Trump term.
Well, it's not an easy path, but the media very much wants you and me and all of us to give up on it.
Yep.
And that is not right. It's not the mainstream media that picks our next president. It's the American people who elect the president. And what's occurring now is part of the process, which is that there are multiple lawsuits in multiple states challenging the outcome. And those recounts, that litigation, has to conclude. And an election isn't over until the results are final, until the results are determined. And right now, that litigation, the timing on that litigation is a matter of weeks. It's not going to take months, but it is going to take several weeks. And once that is over, we will have a conclusive answer as to who won the presidential race. But at this point, what I would advise folks is just let the process play out. And we operate under a system of rule of law where the courts have a responsibility to adjudicate these claims and to ensure that we're following federal law and state law and that we're following the Constitution. And
it's not just recounts, because people will say, well, historically, recounts don't tend to shift a result very much, and that's true. But there's a lot more than that under the microscope. It's actual procedures of how many votes were permitted after the proper close of vote tabulation in Pennsylvania. There's some basic procedural questions that some of these court actions are asking.
No, that's exactly right. And there's some similarities to what happened 20 years ago in Bush versus Gore. As you know, I was part of the legal team that represented George W. Bush in Bush versus Gore. I was a young lawyer at the time, and the book I just wrote, One Vote Away, How a Single Supreme Court Seat Can Change History, has an entire chapter that takes you inside of Bush versus Gore, inside of what was happening there, to understand, if you really want to understand the issues that are playing out in litigation right now in courts all over the country. My new book, One Vote Away, helps you understand it by explaining the crazy roller coaster that happened in Tallahassee 20 years ago, and that's happening here today, right now.
And if there are some things that work their way to the Supreme Court, they will not rule on whom they want to be president any more than the Supreme Court did in Bush v. Gore. Bush did not win the favor of the Supreme Court because they wanted him to win. They won the favor of the Supreme Court because the Florida Supreme Court erroneously tried to write election law from the bench.
Yep. No, that's exactly right. The responsibility of the courts is not to pick whichever political candidate they happen to like. The responsibility of the courts is to follow the law and to ensure that the election is consistent with the law. That means counting every single legal vote, but it also means not counting every vote that was illegally cast. And that's right at the heart of what is being litigated right now. And you know, if you think about in Bush versus Gore, we had a full-on trial on the merits in state court. We went to the Florida Supreme Court twice. We went to the U.S. Supreme Court twice. In both instances, we fully briefed the case. We had oral argument for the case, and the justices decided the case and handed down the opinion. All of that happened over the course of 36 days. So the courts can move expeditiously to resolve these matters. You know, on a question of voter fraud, we're hearing a lot of talk about fraud. Frankly, it's difficult, Mark, for you or me or for anybody to know exactly what's true and exactly what isn't. You know, if you're reading Twitter or social media, what have you, and you have this accusation, that accusation, thankfully, that's not how these matters get resolved. The way they get resolved is in a court of law. What is happening right now, and the obligation of the Trump legal team is to go and prove their case, go and introduce evidence and expert witnesses and direct testimony and subject it to cross-examination and prove the case. And I very much hope that is what they do in the weeks coming forward. And then the trial courts exist to determine questions of fact. And so we will have rulings from the court in terms of the how widespread fraud was in the various elections, which is going to be critical to knowing who actually prevailed in the election.
Senator Ted Cruz is here. It is funny that we're being scolded by Democrats and the media, but I repeat myself, we're being scolded that this is terrible, where the democracy's under attack. We don't have this kind of time to pay attention to this. It's without basis. We have no evidence of widespread fraud. It's funny that if it's a Russia collusion fantasy, they'll drag us down that rat hole for 3 years, but they won't give us this moment of time of 3 weeks to ask some very basic questions.
Well, it's not complicated. The media hates Donald Trump, and so they are celebrating. They're popping champagne. They were eager to call the race for Joe Biden the very instant that they had any plausible basis to do so. And now it's really bizarre, the moralizing and lecturing. How dare you say that the legal proceedings must conclude? How dare you say that we've got to finish the litigation before we know the results? I mean, it's really quite ridiculous. Think back again to Bush versus Gore. As I recount in the book One Vote Away, on election night, the news media initially called Florida for Al Gore, and then they called the presidency for Al Gore. Then they realized the votes didn't back up what they'd said, so they reversed their call. Mm-hmm. And then they called Florida for George W. Bush. Then they called the presidency for George W. Bush. All of this is on election night. But then they realized that it was very, very close in Florida. And so what happened, Al Gore sent in an army of lawyers to Florida. They filed multiple lawsuits. And remember back, in the time when those lawsuits were pending, the media didn't refer to George W. Bush as the president-elect, even though he was leading. Mm-hmm. They didn't call him the president-elect. George W. Bush didn't give press conferences with some stupid sign that someone printed on a laser printer saying, "Office of the President-elect," whatever the heck that is. I mean, it really is that next time they should do it in crayons if they're just going to make things up. But not, and you know what? It would have been wrong to call George W. Bush at that time the president-elect because the process was still going forward. Now, when the litigation was concluded and when he had won, that's when George W. Bush became the president-elect. That might happen here. Joe Biden might prevail at the end of this process, but it is absurd to suggest that following the law and the Constitution and allowing the legal process to play out is somehow undermining democracy.
Yeah, let's also remember that as Al Gore pursued his legal avenues, which he had every right to do, the media culture did not pillory and harangue and demonize him for doing so. All right, so if here's something else we're being scolded for. Senator Ted Cruz is with us, and that Trump is being scolded for, I guess, since this could go either way, and maybe leaning one way over the other. We'll just sort of see. The notion of whether Joe Biden, whether he is president-elect or not, needs to be receiving security briefings now. Your colleague, Mr. Langford in Oklahoma, whom I like, seems to think that should be happening, and if it doesn't, then he'll kind of run some end run to see to it that Biden gets security briefings. Should he be getting them now?
I think that's very reasonable, and one of the things that happens in this process is that both of the major party nominees start to get security briefings even before the election, because for the sake of protecting the country, you want whoever is going to assume that office to be aware of the significant threats, because the first responsibility of any president is to keep the American people safe.
I completely agree with you. And yet, that's you, that's me. I don't know if that's the president. I don't know if I know his mind or you do. You know him a little better than I do. There's something about delivering those briefings to Biden that smacks of concession, and I don't think he's going to display one molecule of behavior that smacks of concession.
Well, that may well be. Neither you nor I are psychologists, amateur or otherwise. But I am a lawyer, or at least I play one on TV, and my focus is going to be that we continue to follow the law and follow the Constitution, which is, I think, what most Texans and most Americans want.
Then for our final area of inquiry as a lawyer and legislator, let's take a look at the areas of election law that have been savaged and the fixes, repairs, the progress we may want to make moving forward, no matter how this year turns out. Election Day used to be an incredible civic exercise. The home stretch toward Election Day demanded something of the candidates. It demanded something of us. It was a civic responsibility. We have dashed all of that against the rocks on the altar of the whim of convenience. A month of early voting. We don't need a postmark. We don't need a signature match. It's a nightmare. What deserves attention in fixing this mess?
Well, I actually think the way Texas does it works quite well. We have a couple of weeks of early voting, in-person early voting with some leniency. I don't know about you, but I almost always vote early, but in person because it's more convenient that way. What we've seen across the country is a number of states, particularly blue states, shift overwhelmingly to mail-in voting. And mail-in voting in particular, there's a long history and a sordid history that shows that it's much more susceptible to fraud. We have a case here in the state of Texas where the Attorney General, Ken Paxton, announced an indictment of a Texas social worker who was indicted on 134 counts of voter fraud. Why? Because there were mail-in voter registrations in a nursing home, a home for people who are elderly and have significant cognitive disabilities, where she filled out the forms for them and was trying to vote for them, and a significant number of them were determined to be not competent, not mentally competent to make a decision. They had not chosen to vote, but rather she was harvesting their votes and trying to vote for her preferred candidate. That is a real danger. We see Democrats across the country trying to shift voting more and more in that direction, and I think we need to work to stand against it, because we need to stop the abuse that can come from it.
The brand new Ted Cruz book, One Vote Away, How a Single Supreme Court Seat Can Change History. Always a pleasure, sir. Continued safety, you, the Heidi, the girls. Much appreciate you. Always appreciate your time.
Thank you, my friend. And I would note the book is now 5 weeks in a row on the New York Times bestseller list. It was the #1 bestseller on Amazon, and so I would encourage folks, go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble or wherever you get your books, particularly right now with all the crazy litigation going on. It'll really help you understand what's happening and take you behind the scenes, understand what happens at the Supreme Court with all of the big constitutional issues you and I care about: free speech, religious liberty, the Second Amendment, and protecting our democracy, which is what we're doing right now.
One Vote Away, How a Single Supreme Court Seat Can Change History. Senator Ted Cruz on Twitter @TedCruz, cruz.senate.gov. Thanks, sir. Talk to you soon. I know. Thanks.